Thank you all for being here. Okay, I'm going to spill the beans and tell you what is going on. We're missing part of the people who are invited, not the VIP guests, we've got everyone. But we are waiting for a group of 50 middle school and high school students who are lost in Châtelet-Léal. So if at some point you hear a little noise, don't be worried. Thank you all for being here tonight. So I'm Clémentine Tolos, the co-organizer of this roundtable. And this is with great pleasure that Laurence Cossu-Beaumont and I welcome you to this discussion, a discussion which is part of an ongoing series dedicated to contemporary visual artists. So last year we were delighted to welcome Glenn Ligon and Emo de Medeiros, and he's here tonight for us, so it's a great pleasure once again. And tonight we have the privilege of meeting two visionary artists. So HANK WILLIS THOMAS, please give him a round of applause. Save some, because we've got another amazing artist, and Raphaël Barontini, a round of applause as well. So their work inspire us to re-examine the ways. Oh, we've got a group. Venez, venez. Here they are. Youpi!
C'est l'événement, le laisser venir à la Sorbonne.
Bon, les jeunes, vous arrivez pile au bon moment. On est hyper content que vous soyez là. Maintenant, branchez votre cerveau sur l'anglais parce qu'il n'y a plus de français. Je sais, c'est un peu dur. Non, mais ça nous fait plaisir que vous soyez là. Venez. So I was telling you, these two artists inspire us to re-examine the ways history, identity, and power are represented in the public sphere and in cultural institutions. Their practices question dominant historical narrative and reframe collective memory to foster bold and politically engaged visions that promote critical thinking and reflection, not only among younger generations, these younger generations at the back, but beyond. So as educators, don't worry, it's a short speech. It's just, I'm short-sighted and it's big. So as educators, Laurence and I strongly believe that universities must play an active role in shaping a more equitable and conscious world. So these convictions drives our dedication to incorporating the works of artists like HANK WILLIS THOMAS and Raphaël Barontini into university curricula. So though rooted in distinct geographies, their practices offer meaningful insight into the intertwined legacies of colonialism, slavery, and systemic racism. And they also highlight the potential of art as a tool for healing, resistance, and social transformation. This conversation also happens at a time of growing concern. So in the United States in particular, we are witnessing a wave of political and cultural backlash that threatens the autonomy of museums, the integrity of artists, and the inclusion of historically marginalized voices. And this is why we are proud to host this event, not only as professors, but as citizens. So tonight's roundtable will be moderated by Rujeko Hockley. She's known for her trailblazing work at the Whitney Museum of American Art and a commitment to social justice in curatorial practices. She recently curated the acclaimed exhibition of Aimé Chiro's portrait, American Sublime, a powerful reflection on identity, race, and representation in contemporary portraiture. Alongside Rujeko, we are joined by Aurélie Voltz, director of the Musée d'art moderne et contemporain de Saint Etienne, who has led crucial initiatives to diversify the museum's collection and exhibitions. So her curatorial work often engages with post-colonial histories and the politics of memory, and she will bring critical insights from an institutional perspective. We are also joined by Alicia Knock, sorry. here. So Alicia is a curator at the Centre Pompidou. She's known for championing emerging and underrepresented voices in the global art scene. And she's currently leading the influential exhibition Paris Noir, which explored the history and impacts of the African diaspora in the Parisian. Ah, the second group. Venez, venez.
Last words in French.
It's better that they arrive when I'm speaking. Alors, la seule chose, vous pouvez vous mettre où vous voulez, juste pas à côté de la caméra. Voilà, pour des raisons, voilà, qui est là. Et si vous voulez, là-bas, il y a une coursive en haut, vous pouvez vous asseoir, il reste des places ici. Okay, so I was saying that Alicia is currently leading the exhibition Paris Noir, which explored the history and impacts of the African diaspora in Parisian cultural life. And finally, Egidia Marques Souto from Sorbonne Nouvelle, who has collaborated with Musée du Quai Branly and Fondation d'Aper to bridge art history and cultural studies. Her work explores representation and identity, and she co-curated exhibitions such as Prehistomania at the Musée de l'Homme and Césaria Evora, Portrait of an Icon, currently on view. So we are also extremely grateful to the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Institut des d'Amérique, and the Frame Network for their support in making this event possible. So now that we have everyone, and we are extremely relieved, I must say. So let's start this conversation to explore each artist's individual practice, and then we can broaden the discussion to wider challenges about diversity, equity, and historical accountability in the art world. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for the lovely introduction and for having us. I'm saying us because Hank and I are married to each other, so I just say that out front. So we came together, so thank you for having us together. It's very special. We don't get to do talks together very often, though we're in the same field, so I just want to say thank you. And in general to this whole panel and to this whole room of people, you may think it's very standard to be in this room. I think it's kind of amazing. Very beautiful surroundings, so thank you for having us. For this roundtable, I do want us to kind of talk together, and the 6 of us to kind of have a conversation about this topic, which I would say 1, 2, 3, 4 are more the experts in this context than Hank and I are, so please jump in. But contemporary Black artists in museums, I would say if my career had a subtitle, that would be, my memoir that I haven't written, that's the subtitle, Contemporary Black Artists in Museums. This is something that I've been devoted to for 2 decades, working at many different museums across different registers, different cities, but primarily in the United States. And I should say, I wish that I was bilingual, so I'm sorry that I'm not, because it feels unfair to not speak the language of the place that you're in. So that's my failing, so I'm sorry. But in any case, yes, I think it's coming here to Paris with Paris Noir, which I wanted to see today, but this is what happens to everyone in New York at the Whitney, closed on Tuesdays. So we'll
Never closed for you.
Well, it's okay. I took a nap instead. I didn't try that hard, so tomorrow. But that show is up right now. I also, just looking through the shows that are up in galleries, I see Lorraine O'Grady has a beautiful show with Marianne Ibrahim, Frank Bowling. Of course, Raphael's beautiful show closed 2 days ago, so I did not get to see it. But it seems like there's so many interesting things happening on this topic in a kind of broad sense. So I would say that rather than perhaps I introduce the two of you as artists, I think we do have a PowerPoint. Maybe we can just start it. I think it's just going to keep going because I can't keep looking back like this. So you all can see it. We'll just cycle through, and if either of you see things you want to talk about from your angle, because I can't see it, you share. But yes, I think two artists working kind of in aligned kind of mission around perhaps questions of history, the importance of history and memory in the context of art, in the context of contemporary life. Thinking particularly about the Black diaspora, thinking about kind of the global majority, which is, you know, people of color, that experience, which is a global experience. So, Raphael, maybe I'll start with you.
Okay.
Unless, would you like to introduce yourselves in more fulsome manner? Then it's up to you.
I mean, I can introduce myself just briefly, but so I am Raphaël Barondini. I grew up in Saint-Denis. I was born in Saint-Denis, just in the north outskirts of Paris. I still have my studio over there in Saint-Denis, and I did my studies in Paris and a little bit in New York. So I was a student at the École Nationale des Beaux-Arts in Paris for 5 years, and I did a year at Hunter College in New York. And it was important in my in my work, and I will explain why. But so yeah, I can say also that I'm mainly maybe a painter, but my practice is also divided in different forms, and I practice painting, but also textile, costumes. I create costumes, and I do a lot of performances since maybe 5 years. And all these different directions are totally connected, but it's just a development of my primary work, who is painting. Voilà.
Okay, thank you. Your turn.
Hi everyone, enchanté. Je ne parle pas français aussi. Désolé. I always choose to introduce myself as a person first. I think being a person and being a conscious person is a creative act, which I'm not always doing. And what I love about being a creator is that we are translating our consciousness into a physical form. And I grew up in New York City, and my mother, Deborah Willis, was an artist, art historian, photographer, and I never really thought about it, but I guess some might say activist. Her interest was in photography, the history of photography, and her first book was called Black Photographers, 1840 to 1940, a biobibliography, and it was the first published archive, major published archive of black photographers dating back to the 1800s. And many of those actually were in the Caribbean. And what she did in publishing this book is she challenged the history. In 1840, especially in the United States, but most of the world, slavery was still legal. And black photographers were taking pictures in 1840. And what does it mean in the context of a slave state for someone to be able to have the means to understand physics and science and mechanics and chemistry, and also have a creative inspiration and desire to make images on glass plates? That means that goes against all of the stereotypes about what black people were capable of doing in that time. And that really influenced me, and I should have put other slides of my work in there. But in a way, it really showed me that what's going on inside the frame of a camera is of any story. Like we look around, all of these people are storytellers, and they frame a world. It's like a window to look into. And so much of my work is about framing and context and how, depending on where you stand, it affects what you see. I also have a public sculpture practice where I put giant sculptures like a 28-foot Afro which in the desert, and it's traveled all over the country. And for me, there's the history of monuments in the United States is really fraught, where there are a lot of many monuments to slave owners, and not many monuments or stories told about the descendants of slaves and their triumphs. And so I made that a part of my practice as well, in both subtle and more direct ways.
Thank you. So in thinking about this question of kind of French-American conversation around where we see artists of color and maybe kind of the very wide range of interests that may present in that context, which is everything. And I've heard a couple times seen written that France is 10 years behind the US, which, and I don't know, I think now all of this who's behind who is shifting a little bit. But I'm curious, you know, Raphael, you mentioned that your time at Hunter this year at Hunter in New York was very influential for you, has really impacted your practice. I'm curious, why did you decide to spend that year in New York? And was it something specific about Hunter? It's a great program, part of the CUNY system, which is the public university system in New York City. And then how has it shifted how you maybe now think about being an artist of color, being a Black artist in France?
So I just introduced myself speaking about the media that I practice, but I didn't really mention the subjects that I work in all different forms. I have a work who question the global history, who connected the territories of the Caribbean and the different colonial empire from Europe. And I grew up in a family who is partly from Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, and I was a lot during my childhood in the Caribbean, and I could witness at the same time very powerful collective traditions like the carnival or different types of performance in music, and they are all connected to political subjects, I would say, and I always been in my work totally obsessed with the question of representation. So in terms of like the starting point of my practice when I was a student was the question of portraits and how what we can see in the history of art really shaped a relation, also not just only in terms of representation and figuration, but also it just says a lot about what happened in our history. And I developed a work with this question of portraiture. First of all, very classically, in terms of the use of the media, like the paintings, the screen printing in my work, and I really fastly developed other phases in my practice and the gain of other materials like textile, and I really, like at the end of my scholarship, when I did my graduation, the graduation show, I developed really the starting point of what I do now. It's to question the history of painting and all what carry the media of painting, but also open it and show how painting can be seen in another way, mixing the question of the shape of artworks, the use of textile, the use of forms like flags, banners, who immediately give an information to the public about what reminds those forms in terms of collective, of struggles. That's really the beginning of my interest in work. And when I was doing that at the Beaux-Arts, when I was a student, I really faced a kind of non-interest in my practice with the teachers, with the different juries. When, throughout my scholarship, I had to show and explain my work, my practice. And I would say that my exchange in New York at Hunter was completely necessary and at the same time a powerful moment in my scholarship and career, because if I wouldn't go to New York studying at Hunter, I would not be the artist that I am today. I say that because when I was a student, I was kind of depressed about the reception of my work and the topics I was managing, about the history of slavery, the question of the memory of that, through the idea of figuration and how a part of the French history is not visible. And I was trying to manage all these questions, and I just faced teachers and juries who were not interested in that. And I would say maybe the worst part was that when I was talking about artists from African descent who was really references for me as an artist, I was just in front of teachers who didn't know the artist that I was mentioning. Mm-hmm. And it was between 2005 and 2010, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
There you go.
I'm very tired, I have to say.
2010.
It's a new language.
Yes.
And during that time, I was mentioning amazing artists like Kerry James Marshall, Romary Bearden, Jacob Lawrence, all these artists who really shaped my work in a way and my vision. And no one knew these guys in France. So when I arrived in New York, I discovered institutions who were supporting art communities, artists of colors, and it was completely, I was moved to discover, for example, the Studio Museum of Harlem. I was going there like every Sunday after the church service, but no, frankly, I was really touched to see how institutions could support these visions, these imaginaries. And in a way, when I came back in France, in Paris, to finish my scholarship, I was just like, okay, let's continue what I want to work. Let's keep my topics where I have to, work and manage all those issues. And yeah, that was just a very strong moment where I had to go outside France to understand that I had to continue my work and go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that is a common, I also felt like I had to teach my professors what I was interested in so that they could help me to further my interests when I was in graduate school in the US. So just to give you, luckily or unluckily, it's a common experience.
One thing that I'm always contending with is the notion of race, because it is a fabrication, and it was fabricated to make certain people better than others. And so any time that I'm actually even dealing with or acknowledging race, I recognize that I'm participating in a form of white supremacy. And why I'm so interested in perspective and framing is because that is a frame, race, that is very real in the United States especially. And I had I didn't get to study here, but I lived here for like a year and a half over time. And one of the things that struck me was how much freer black people felt to, because of, there was not slavery en masse here. And many of the people that I met who were from different countries, and I found like there is a difference between someone from Guadeloupe and that were part of the, was it Outremer, versus someone, people from other French Caribbean countries versus people from Senegal, or, and so there's almost like these very different black identities that there's not like one kind of singular story. And in those stories, the stories of African Americans are like not necessarily relevant. And that was a really humbling experience, because coming from the United States, where there is a sense of hegemony, like we believe that what happens in the United States is the totality of history, including World War II. And so I got to kind of relearn here my own identity, and there were times when I went places where I felt uncomfortable, and I was like, are they being racist, or are they just being French? And because I couldn't tell the difference, I just kept going. And there is, I think, sometimes a freedom in not being able to understand the cultural context fully that you're in, so that you can navigate differently. I'm really always looking for like avenues to kind of expand my own notion of myself through making work that is difficult to pin my own identity down. And that is part of a freedom for me.
Thank you. Well, so I'm curious, Alicia, Aurélie, and Egidia, from your perspective, so if in 2010, which I will just say now forever, I love it, if in the last now can I even do math, the last 15 years, there has been some shift in these questions of maybe even like of pedagogy and education, of knowledge, of a wider spectrum of artists from different parts of the world, from different histories, from different experiences. I'm excuse me, curious from your perspectives as people who work in institutions, how do you see that shift? And also please introduce yourselves to the people. Do you want to start? Here, Alicia?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me in this panel. It's a real honor and a real pleasure to be sitting with you all. Also because, of course, there is this big Paris Noir exhibition happening right now, but it really is more than just an exhibition for the institution. And I guess it's really, I'm very grateful that Raphaël, your work is being shown at the same time. Because that's what we wanted. We wanted to occupy the city, just because the city has been occupied with those histories for so long. And it's interesting because, you know, I don't know how many minutes we've spent already, and it feels like we are in this interesting already contradiction and very difficult conversation where, you know, there's Trump in the US preventing, you know, your work to happen, but then there's Raphael's experience, you know, 15 years ago, who's telling us, you know, that as, you know, an artist of color here, also claiming, you know, some references and some histories that are very much connected to the history of this country, it was impossible for you to work here on these topics, and you have to go to the US to continue doing the work, even though you feel that it is expanding your Black experience to be here. So there's really, we are in the middle of, you know, and of course, Raphaël, you mentioning also the fact that a lot of the artists that you were using as references, you know, studying here were not known of your teachers or anyone. And of course, this Paris Noir is also catching up, you know, with that history, including 150 artists across the Caribbean, Africa, and the US, and a first generation of Afro-descendant artists also born here. So it's, you know, that's just to say that we have to sit together. It's really important because I think there are so many nuances and we need each other, and we always, you know, we keep like starting the conversation, but the reality is, even though Trump is actually preventing the US from working, you see all the African scholars, Caribbean scholars trained here. They are, they're teachers in American universities. Most of the artists in the Paris Noir exhibition that made their works here are now collected back in American institutions, written about in American universities. So I think, it's, of course, there is an effort in French institutions to open up, and I hope that, we are, that these exhibitions are finally, triggering these machines. But I think, it's also, it's a country that has been, it's also really difficult because within universities, within even the subjects that you're able to study, the fact that there's no post-colonial studies, Black studies, that race cannot be addressed, even though, of course, it is a complicated notion, but the fact that we cannot speak about race, that there's no language around race in this country, is also very difficult, because even just having noir in the title of that exhibition was very difficult, because it feels like, today, like in France, just saying noir is considered a racist thing.
Were there other titles that were desired?
No.
Did they want you to come up with a different one, or you just...
They wanted a different title, but there was no other title.
No, I know for you there's no other title. I'm with you. I'm just curious always about, the ways in which, because that is true, like, that is really important perspective, because I think the subtitle, artistic circulation, is really important of the Paris Noir exhibition, because whether administrations, whatever, Trump, new Trump, ideas will circulate, artists will make work, people will talk about work, people will be engaged in ideas, and a life of ideas and of making and of the kind of inherent liberation of creativity and imagination, which cannot be legislated away. It's just not, all of human history can show us that that does not work. It can be made more difficult and more painful and more onerous and more dangerous, but it cannot ever be deleted away. So, but it's just an interesting context to hear even that the noir was a problem, because we don't have that problem, but we're sometimes...
So that's why we need each other.
Yeah, it's symbiotic, and I think the idea of circulation and that these ideas, artists, over hundreds of years, this is not a new kind of circulation.
Yeah, and also because, Hank, exactly because of what you just said, that there is this plural, this diversity of Black experiences here across Africa, the Caribbean, and the US, and that, Blackness is a powerful thing also when thinking about those histories, because then it also allows you to think about a transnational space, which is the Black Atlantic, which is, of course, a very difficult space, but that also is kind of bringing also geographies and kind of crossing geographies.
And there's also, in the there is a tradition of African Americans coming here, going
for
back
a century.
Josephine Baker or James Baldwin, people coming to study here and actually feeling that Blackness was not as relevant, so that also gave them a new autonomy and changed the way they operated when they came to the United States.
And so, Aurélie, so I'm Aurélie Voltz, I'm the director of the Museum of Saint Etienne, and we have, of course, the same experience, but of course, I think, all these institutions, in France, there is more than 1,300 museums that are supported by Ministry of Culture. And I can tell you that most of the time, the collections are very important, were created, let's say, in the middle of the 19th century. And today, for example, in Saint Etienne, if you consider the collection, we have 23,000 works. And we can say that 95% of these artists are male, white, Occidental. So it just gives you an idea of, where we are. So it means that there's very few women artists, and I just don't tell you how much Black artists we have in the collection. Maybe one, Barthélemy, Togo. So there's a lot of work to do.
There's a lot of room for improvement.
Yes.
A lot of opportunity.
So yeah, well, and we acquired also some works of José Fanjam. But this is just the starting point, I would say, and it's not about 15 years ago, it's now that it's happening. So that's why I'm showing here 10 images about the project curated by Mo Laudi. Maybe you know him, he's DJ also. And in 2022, when in Saint Etienne there was the Design Biennale, who invited Africa, the African continent, and I thought it's interesting to do something in the same time at the museum. And myself, I'm just a director, and I don't have any idea of what is today all this African scene. And I thought, okay, I invite Mo Laudi, and he started already quite a lot of work about this. It's not just about music, but it's a global history with global culture. And his exhibition called Globalisto gathered about 19 artists that you can see on here now on the screen. And of course, Raphael Barontini was part of the adventure, I would say. So you can see maybe some images of the show. But for us, it was totally new. I mean, it was first time that we had this opportunity to gather some artists, coming from different African countries, also from America and from the diaspora, of course. And it was also the first time and first occasion to talk about art and decolonization, because we organized also a panel discussion about this in October, just a few months later. And the opportunity also to invite some writers, and Achille Membe also, and Norma Najari. And it was the first time that we had so much attention about all this subject, and that we could also talk about all these differences, of course, between what happened in America and what happens in Europe, and of course this different history and this different reception that is so important to understand how we can, of course, go forward. How do you say this? How go forward, and what needs to be done now. It's such a huge work to do. So it's just the starting point here. At least in Saint Etienne, I don't know what are the projects in other museums, but I think it was super important for us to do it. And
sorry, I just realized I haven't responded to your question, but I would say that for me, I've been 10 years now at the museum, and I could see a shift. Definitely 5 years ago, when Black Lives Matter happened, and when the Africa 2020, so 2020 season happened in France, curated by Ngone Fall, who really did something really important, which was to impose a new methodology on the way French institutions were operating, which means that she really imposed on French institutions to collaborate and to have co-curators from institutions and curators based on the continent, and there was no compromise with that. So it was really, it was really bringing a new way of working into the institution. And I guess what the big challenges are for French institutions now is also to see how beyond, of course, acquisitions, exhibitions, and this kind of long-term vision that we're trying to implement with such projects, how we can also shift the way institutions work, and of course questions of research, long-term research, questions of community outreach, questions of representation, obviously within French institutions, which is a big issue. And I remember us, Rujeko, sitting at the Ford Foundation at the time some years ago, and already speaking about that in New York, and because we really lack representation in French institutions, not only regarding the artists that are being included in those museum narratives, but also in museum staff, and same in French universities. So
and then Egidia.
Hi, I have to say that I'm really very happy to be here, and I want to say that my colleagues, Laurence and Clémentine, they are like activists inside of the university, because 10 years ago, we didn't have moments like this. And start last year, and I'm a teacher, but when I see the classes they do, I say, why didn't I start studying now? Because I remember 15 years ago, when 10, maybe more than 15 years ago, when I started to work at Musée du Quai Branly and Musée d'Aper, it was the only places to talk about this. And even Beaux-Arts, maybe 2 or 5 students from Africa, and the teachers never talk about this. It's like the times were very difficult, but I have to say, things change. Of course, we want things change very fast. But I remember the exhibition of Daniel Soutif, Jazz, and the color line at Musée du Quai Branly. It was a beginning. I remember some teachers who says, we didn't know nothing about this. I remember it was the first time we see African American. It's 5 years ago. The first time I remember the discussions about the terms, how to say these terms or that terms, and I think even at Musée de Saint Etienne, sorry, with the language, it's maybe the moment of changing. And of course, with Paris Noir, I have to say thank you, because it's a scandal, a good scandal, because even in the universities of Angola, a colleague called me and said, oh, they did it, Paris Noir, and it's legal in France, because this term of noir, you know. And I think maybe because of you talk about your experience, maybe Beaux-Arts need to change too. Maybe the academy and the university have to change.
Of course, it depends the teachers. It also depends because it's a public school. So mainly in France, I would say that I was an exception with some colleagues, some young students who were from working class backgrounds, having access to this type of school. Also because there is a social kind of frontier, border to just access to a school like that. Not because of the cost, because it's public school, but maybe because as a student from the outskirts of Paris, you don't imagine yourself as an artist and making art when your family just needs money and to manage everything. And so there is also, it's not just only the question of color, it's also the question of just social backgrounds, I think. But we are making some progress because
yes.
the teachers are changing, and also I have some friends who are teachers now, and the new students, it's a little bit more mixed. It's not like everything has changed, but there is a step. So.
And I think you're so fortunate here to have a Ministry of Culture that supports, even though maybe it's confined, that supports the arts. I shudder to think of what a Ministry of Culture would look like in the United States right now. But I think it's so important for us to recognize the way in which, as I mentioned earlier, art is storytelling, and there is a creativity in curation that actually opens worlds, and the fact that your show could impact people in Angola is a really powerful thing. And so I'm always thinking about how we can, just by making small or sometimes big gestures, just putting a word, an artist can open up a space for there to be more liberation.
Yeah, I think that I'm really struck by, I think, it's all perspective. It's important to have perspective because I do think, that would not be an issue in the United States, but there are many other things that would be. And I think this idea of a Ministry of Culture, though it is limited or finite and, to be encouraged to expand and grow, just implies a baseline appreciation and understanding for the importance of culture in society. And I think in the United States, that has never been a given. I would say as a country, as a society, it is not is the way that at least I interpret in France, that there is a kind of baseline, art and culture, whether it's only these people.
Yeah, gatekeeping, yeah.
Yeah, but there's a baseline understanding that art and culture is important to society. And I think in the United States, sometimes we're like, hello, we can't really have a society without art and culture. And what society would that be? Who wants to live there? Whereas I think here, we may push against, does it have to be only Descartes? There's so many other things to think about, ways to think about the world, ways to orient our approach to the world. There's different philosophies coming from all the people who've come from all the places in the world that France colonized. This is the inverse of the colonial project. But the idea even that someone like Descartes is important, this is not, we don't have this in the United States exactly. So I just want to say it's the perspective is important to realize. I wanted to talk a little bit, Raphael, about your show that just closed 2 days ago at the Palais de Tokyo, Somewhere in the Night, The People Dance. It's a beautiful title. So congratulations, first of all. I'm very sad that we missed it by 2 days. But yeah, I was curious if you could share a little bit about the exhibition. And you've had this exhibition at the Palais de Tokyo. You also had this exhibition at the Pantheon, which two kind of very different types of French institutions. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about that. And then
about both?
Yeah, about both. Just share a little bit about those two projects and maybe just reflect on those sites.
So
or not, whatever you want.
Okay.
It's okay to go off.
Yeah. The show we just closed at the Palais Tokyo, Somewhere in the Night, The People Dance, was referring to the play written by Aimé Césaire, a writer from Martinique. That is also a big reference for me artistically, and it was a way for me to combine, in a way, imaginary and reality, because the play of Césaire about the King Christophe is based on real facts and real characters. King Christophe was one of the key leaders of the insurrection of enslaved people in Haiti. He was a lieutenant of Toussaint Louverture. He was in charge of the north part of Haiti, and he decided to create a kingdom. So the kingdom, I think, was something like 10 years, and he decided to, as a new nation who was Haiti, in the first step of that new country, to try to be at the same level than the European empires, and to be on the same stage and same level. He decided to create amazing architectural building like the Palais Sans Souci, for example. And the Palais Sans Souci is really the base of the show, because it was the scenography of the show was based on the architecture of the Palais Sans Souci. The show was really built as a possibility for me to show all the different forms in my practice. So we had a lot of pre-existent pieces, paintings, textiles, one from the Pantheon show. But it was a little bit like a second act of the show at the Pantheon. And it was just a way in an art center to manage the showing of all these different practices, and to stage it and to create an immersive space where the spectator can be totally immersed in in that narrative of Henri Christophe. The show at the Panthéon was different because, of course, creating an exhibition in an art center and in a monument is totally different. I had to manage and to create the integrality of the artworks regarding the architecture of the place, and also discuss with the artworks already presented in the building. So I created, I don't know, yeah, we have the pictures. So the idea was to celebrate figures of resistance from different territories in Guadeloupe, Martinique, but also French Guiana, the Réunion Islands, other territories like Haiti also, and just to politically and artistically install the presence of these figures in the national historical narrative. Because it's a little bit like a collection. The Panthéon has maybe 95% of white men buried in the building.
Yeah.
And it's just a very recent move that people like Josephine Baker are buried and honored in that building. So really like my intention was just to kind of equilibrate, it's in anglais? Yeah, equalized. Yeah, the presence in these types of building. The Panthéon is particular because it's a building who shaped the French history. Yeah. You know, the president decides who is buried over there and who is honored. And as a visual artist, I was kind of happy to just be allowed during 4 months to honor people that I wanted to honor. And that show was also in a mirror with an historical show in the crypt of the building, in the museum, not in the monument, sorry. And in the crypt of the Panthéon, you had a historical exhibition created by the Fondation pour la Mémoire de l'Esclavage, who is an organization here in France. And it was a kind of, diptych with contemporary art proposition in the church, and in the crypt, a more historical exhibition.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think this idea of putting kind of art into a monument is really interesting, especially one that has such historical resonance. And then, Hank, you are making new monuments. And I'm so curious if you could talk, Hank, a little bit about the kind of public art aspect of your practice and about kind of how you expanded your practice to include kind of permanent, works of art that will persist for millennia, all things being equal.
Yeah, I've always been interested in storytelling in public space. As you mentioned, that the Panthéon is a place for storytelling of who is important and how we should honor those who are important. And I think this city is full of monuments, of storytelling devices around, largely with men on horses, that celebrate triumph through violence, triumph through war or domination. There are also some to thinkers, which is unique, but I've always been fascinated with this kind of awe of looking up at this person who's, I guess, still alive because of through the public memory. And I grew up in Washington, D.C., which was modeled in some ways around Paris with the broad boulevards, certain monuments, and there's something majestic about that. And there are so few people of African descent that are actually being able to navigate that space, to actually put something in space that changes the way that people perceive who and what's important. So in some of my monuments, I think, in the Embrace, which I showed earlier, This is a monument to Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, which is in Boston Common, which is the oldest continuously used public space in the United States. And this Martin Luther King, American civil rights activist, and his wife, Coretta Scott King, also an American civil rights activist, met on their first date was in this park. And they are heroes of nonviolent action for social change. And what I was fascinated with was that Martin Luther King was assassinated when he was 39 in 1968, and his legacy was carried by his wife for 40 years. And there was this concept of the beloved community that they were using creative civic action to build. And I wanted to, rather than just put them on a pedestal and show them as beautiful figures that are far away from us, I wanted to invite the viewer into the heart of their embrace, which is based off of a photograph of them on the day that he received the Nobel Peace Prize. And in that image, I saw his weight was on her shoulders. And so I actually had this kind of beautiful experience. They have one grandchild who came to the opening, and she walked into the sculpture, and she said, I felt like I was looking into a portal and my grandparents were looking down on me, which is pretty amazing. It also happens to be the largest bronze sculpture in the country, which is kind of fascinating. So even though it's a kind of, I don't even call it a modest gesture, but it isn't kind of in your face. I think because of its stature, because of where it is and who it is about, it actually has changed much of the way that people relate to the city of Boston, which is a very historic American city. Here, there aren't as many spaces to make that kind of impact. I know that, I don't know here, but in England and also the United States, there's a process of removing statues from pedestals and changing, kind of either inviting new interpretations. But I wonder, is there much of a tradition of contemporary public art that's permanent?
In France?
Yeah, here in Paris.
Yeah, you have some, for example, even at the Palais Royal with Buren, but also Jardin des Tuileries. There have
there is a public art commission a bit everywhere in France, of course.
Yeah.
So yeah, of course, there's jury. There's.
Yeah. But I mean, I know there's a fascinating public art, but I was thinking about monuments on the scale of of like the obelisk or. Do you have any ambition to do anything like that?
Maybe not. Maybe now there will be.
Yeah.
And also, Hank, if you could also speak maybe to, because you spoke about your mom and her work as a photographer and a photo historian growing up in your family and in that kind of in the archive in some literal senses. And I think there's, specifically with the embrace, when we think about what it means to honor, public figures, we have a very particular image of what that looks like, what type of thing we expect to see. And the embrace is a very different type of monument. And so I'm curious if you could just talk about literally how did you come to this image? Where is this image, this object, this design, where is it coming from? And the kind of connection to photography and historical images in general.
Well, I've also been interested in framing and context, and a photograph always has this frame, which is the truth. And I began, and you can see some other sculptures that my practice in public art is often, for me, like being a photographer, where I'm capturing moments and representing them in three-dimensional space, but they're also cropped. So the embrace is kind of a cropped version of a photograph. There's something else I realized that I wish I had put in the slides, and I'm curious about the perception here. I've made a work in 2019 called Colonialism in Abstract Art. And I created this theory, which it would be better if I had my graphic in front of me, but if you Google Hank Willis Thomas Colonialism Abstract Art, you'll see it. I found that around the time of the exploration, the broad European exploration of Africa and the foundation of the Congo through King Leopold. Around that time in the 1870s, there was a curious thing that was happening that, this is also, correct me if I'm wrong, around the time at the beginning of the Belle Epoque. Is that true? Yeah. And I started to think about this idea of what happened when African artifacts came to Europe, and how fascinating it was that Western art seemed to change dramatically over the course of the next 30 or 40 years, when we saw masks and ivory tusks and chairs coming to, other forms of art coming to Europe. We saw scarification, and it started to take shape, and Art Nouveau became, and Art Deco, and modern art as we know it. And my thesis is that what we call contemporary modern art is a European misinterpretation of African art, that people came up there, like people came into a contact with art that was conceptual, and they couldn't figure out what to do with it. So, and within the studying, I think you look at, of course, Picasso and others, and you think about, and so that's my major thesis that I find to be, well, that I'm challenging. I'm curious your perceptions of it.
Well, it's true that all the museums have this kind of, of course, main collection of this are more in museums like Musée du Quai Branly. But for example, here in Saint Etienne, we have a little collection of African art that was collected by some artists like Victor Brauner, and it was collected in this. In different kind of point of view, of course. It was, of course, inspiration for him to work with, but it is also interesting to see how this piece of art were exhibited next to something else, next to modern art or not. Of course, in the 30s, in the 40s, it was done like this. But how the museum were trying to understand also this kind of sculpture pour elles-mêmes, for themselves, and not systematically trying to explain modern art with them. Of course, it was a very important inspiration, but it's also interesting to see how we can try to isolate them and try to consider them without having this European perspective or history of art perspective. And this is how, also Mo Laudi worked, and he decided to pick one of these sculptures coming from Benin and exhibited it next to his own sculpture. And of course, it created something totally different.
But is it too provocative to suggest that the birth of modern art or contemporary art is in Africa, in African art?
But yeah, in that case, I feel like this history has not been written yet.
I think he's trying to get your feedback on if this is like,
I'm trying to plant the seed into the conversation that African art is the origin of modern art, and this is like a pretty provocative statement. But I also think that because I have one other kind of idea that supports my thesis. Marcel Duchamp made a piece that was really revolutionary in, I think, 1917 that he showed at the Armory show called it was a ready-made. I can't remember what it was. The toilet?
Fontaine.
There we go.
Yes, the fountain. And around the time he was born was the Berlin Conference, where people chose to divide up Africa into a map and say, this is now France, this is now Germany, this is now Belgium. And that was also a gesture of conceptual art. And so that's my full and whole story, but I just wanted to get that out into the ether in case anyone wants to pick up on this idea.
Yeah, what I can say is if I look at the Paris Noir and some strategies that were used when responding to the idea of modernism, because I guess one of the issues at stake with the exhibition is also how artists wrote themselves into modernism and use different strategies to do that. And for example, you have a Haitian artist called Max Manchina, and he decided to appropriate Picasso's cubism, because I guess for him the modernity of Picasso was just the way he appropriated Africa. So I guess it's appropriation, and for him it was really interested in like revisiting Picasso's cubism as a response to what Picasso did with Africa, which had somehow for him nothing to do with Africa, but rather like the way you appropriate.
Aestheticize.
Yeah. So I guess that's one of the ideas that.
Maybe it supports.
Yeah, I think so.
So.
Hank, I don't know if you see a few years ago the exhibition Picasso at Musée du Quai Branly. It was the first time that the curators tried to respond to these complicated questions. I remember, I'm thinking about the Demoiselle d'Avignon, and if we put the Demoiselle d'Avignon and some Congo statues, we can see the similitudes. It's obvious. And I don't know if we can do affirmations, but if definitely true that Cubism and the African art changed the way of seeing forms, shapes, and broken a very conservative, I don't know if it's the word, line, of course.
Yeah, because I just wondered what happens if we start to think about how this, we think about some of these artifacts from the Congo, these sculptures, that their spirit is still alive, and it's somehow transmuted into Western artists, and we don't necessarily have a way to understand that root, and so we look at most 20th century modern art through the lens of a white male creator.
Appropriation.
But many of them were appropriating. Even Marcel Breuer, who made one of his first major architect. One of his first sculptures was an African chair, and so if we start to think about Africa as the root of contemporary society, can we then rethink about the place of African people in these societies?
In some museums, at this moment at the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle de Toulouse, some communities came actually from Benin to complete the stories of collections, and even the traditional practitioners came to tell another story, not only the story is written in collections, but the spiritual story. They ask permission to do rituals. You can also see at this moment at Musée du Quai Branly an exhibition about Dakar, Djibouti, and the historians and the very vast of groups tell another story of these collections, the travels, and this you call artifacts. There's a really last 10 years a work to give them places in art, history of art.
Okay, well, I think the short answer is yes.
Yes.
That's what I heard. I think this is
Spread the word.
This is a path worth pursuing. So I think now I'm going to ask maybe one more question, and then we can transition to questions from you all. So start thinking of your questions, please. So Raphael, you mentioned as we were coming in to come up here that you didn't get to close your exhibition because you were working on your next project. Or your exhibition closed, obviously, but you didn't get to have one last moment with it. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you were working on?
Okay. So I am part of an art festival in Toulouse called the Nouveau Printemps. So I have just made a new textile, a large textile, who will be exhibited in a very old library in the center of Toulouse, and at the same time I organized a performance with the reenactment of the performance that I did at the Panthéon. So not this one, but just the one before. Yep, not that. Yep. So anyway, so that's
Can you tell us about this performance then?
yeah, that's the performance we just did at the Palais de Tokyo, just in front of the exhibition, and it was the performance Bal Pays, who was a very direct reference to the tradition in Guadeloupe of dance, which is called the quadrille, a kind of counter dance, who is a European dance at the beginning, came from Europe with the European colonizers, and this type of dance was a court dance in Europe, and in the Caribbean, mainly in Guadeloupe and Martinique, it became a very popular tradition after the abolition of slavery. Of course, there was a kind of satire, so it was also a kind of a way for former enslaved people to just appropriate themselves this dance, because appropriation can be in both sides, both directions. But they completely changed the tradition musically with the addition of percussions, for example. The rhythm was totally different. And that performance was a kind of, remembering of these traditions who are still alive. So I worked with an association from Montfermeil in Seine-Saint-Denis, just in the north outskirts of Paris, and who are still practicing this dance of quadrille. And we worked with a choreographer, Saido Lelou, who brought 4 contemporary dancers and created a kind of collective moment of, just bringing these traditions in a totally different space with an art center at the Palais de Tokyo. And that's the way I create performances. I just work with local communities, local associations who are mainly practicing their musical traditions or tradition of dance. And I try to create a moment with them and with other inputs. We also worked with a musician who is from Boston, Mike Ladd, who is a long-time collaborator with me, and he created a sound piece who was in the show, but at the same time, he created a part of the music with the traditional musician. So that was, a very specific moment, and it was cool.
And then, so that's what you'll be doing with the same dancers?
So no, in Toulouse, it's not that one. It's the previous slide, who is the performance that I made at the Panthéon, and who was this one, a procession with a series of banners representing 10 figures from different territories who were freedom fighters, and it's a parade, a procession, who is really was a central presence is a group, a band of carnival from Guadeloupe, and it's a very typical tradition called the déboulé, with a groupe à peau tradition, who is based on percussions and who are also very political parade still now, and it's very connected with the history of slavery also, in a way that the appropriation of the public space has a sense and a meaning.
Yeah.
Can I ask the last question? Because I remember this, it was a question I want to ask you, because I remember some years, Akio, for example, with the group Akio. And I have a question, because quadrille, I don't know if you already tried, but it's really, really difficult. Really. And in the museology, we call now participative museology. And my question is, how is your work and you see the vision of resistant working with the communities, for example? And I'm interested because you grow up in Saint-Denis, and it's the most multicultural place in France. How do you do this? You orchestrate these collaborative works?
For example, that performance was like the cherry on the cake for the show at the Panthéon. When I had this commission from the National Monument Center, it was a very important commission because it was also the first time that a visual artist was invited at the Panthéon to speak about those historical topics, and it was a necessary work, but at the same time I felt like, okay, that can't be only the response, the answer from one artist. And I wanted a performance because I wanted to associate also the Caribbean community in Paris at this moment. So, you know, and that traditions, I was musician before to be painter, so I knew this tradition since my childhood. I had some of my uncles and cousins who were part of this band, and that's funny that you mentioned Akio because one of my uncle was a member of Akio in Pointe-à-Pitre. And I knew these traditions since my childhood, and I was like, okay, one day I will do a performance with a band like that. And when I had the commission for the Panthéon show, I was like, okay, that's the moment. Because it was also a political statement that listening this kind of music, listening Creole inside the Panthéon, in that space, in that specific space, was already a strong proposition. Yeah. So yeah, that was the purpose of that performance, and it was quite emotional for those who were there. But
and the doors, when the doors opened,
yeah,
it's really special. Yeah.
You have the sense of irony and joy because
exactly,
like in the theater.
We have to struggle, but we have to be also.
It should be a weekly thing, once a week.
Should be a weekly thing. Well, thank you so much. I think, you know, to sum it up, I think that what I'm really feeling so much is that, this idea of artistic circulation, and that there's so much interchange, not just between the US and France, but between time and history and places and historical movements. I think that's kind of all of what we are kind of talking about and around is like, we don't always acknowledge the circulation of ideas as being, we see the flow often one way, and it's actually unidirectional. And if we want to call it appropriation, we can, but we don't even have to. I think if we can say Africa is the heart and the center of what became modern art in Europe, that doesn't diminish modern art in Europe. It actually makes it more interesting to give that a credit to. If it makes it more interesting to think about France in the 21st century, to think about the Pantheon, this like iconic historical monument, with more people in it, like with more voices, more histories, more incredible, you know, visionaries of the past. Like it actually makes it better. And so I think that this shift, this mindset shift around, we're not talking about a narrowing or taking away, we're talking about an expansion and augmentation and increase in our possibilities, in our histories, and you know what we can do and what the future can do. You know, I think I'm always trying to, you know, I get lots of questions about, that are narrowing questions about often when I give tours in my exhibitions, kind of narrowing questions. Does this Black artist only do this? Why don't they do that? And it's like, there's lots of people doing that. This is another person doing what they're doing, and it adds. It doesn't take away from anyone. So that's kind of where I would like to leave it with us. So thank you all for all this generative conversation and these great ideas, places to go from here. And I think we will go to, yep, there's a microphone. If you have a question, please. Okay, there we go.
Hello. There's a question that's been burning my lips from the very beginning, and it's a comment and a question. The comment part is, this is the first time I hear prominent African-American artists say what you said at the beginning of this roundtable, which is that race was a questionable, or at least open to question, concept, and that you were presenting yourself first as a person. And last year, in the same play, the same context, I had a discussion with Glenn Ligon where my position was closer to yours, and his position was more, I would say, essentialist. And I do think it's at least it's probably questionable and at least open to question. But my question is, do you think there is a generational shift that tends to change the artist's perspective in the US about this question? Meaning that, black and white are simplifications, useful ones, sometimes probably detrimental to the existence of history and geography. But do you think that this perspective where history and geography would come back and some complexity and depth would enter the conversation is something that's happening now?
Well, not so much in the United States. I think there's a lot invested in a black and white history. As you can tell by our leader, simplicity is what's supported. I think in the United States, complexity, nuance aren't things that are celebrated, and we want easy framed. We want our meat and potatoes. We don't want anything else. And that's part of my struggle, frankly, in this desire to challenge. Sometimes within, I had a talk at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and made some of these statements and was basically booed off the stage, which was kind of fascinating. And then I remember an old lady came up to me afterwards. She was just like, I agree with you, but I didn't want to say anything because I was afraid I might get hit. And so, because there's something about the origin story of African Americans is slavery. There is no kind of, so blackness is defined by slavery. So it's kind of the essence of an identity and almost a refusal to kind of imagine the heterogeneity that would have existed. You know, I think it was told that the average African American is 7 generations away from slavery, and by that time you're made up of 128 different people. And those 128 different people would be from different, they weren't from the same village, they weren't from the same town, they weren't from even the same part of the world. And I think that's something that we should, if we can embrace that, I think it makes us greater humans. But I also find, I say that, white power is exclusive and black power is inclusive. What's so important and so fascinating about blackness is that it's an invitation, I think, into a collective human experience. And that's why I think it's so alluring, because you are welcome.
I think there was another hand in the back there. Yeah.
Will it go that far?
Good morning. My name is Juliana and I'm a student. So my question is, do you think that art can bring social change?
Very, very simple and yes, to the point. Thank you. I heard, yes, the question was, do we think that art can bring social change? Yes, I do, personally. I don't know that it is always a one-to-one. I think there is great urgency among those of us, which is, I think, almost everybody, who see the possibilities for a different kind of world that is kind of more equitable and more honest to history and to reality, and that is inclusive and expansive. And so I think the urgency of wanting there to sometimes be a one-to-one between like this artwork, this exhibition, here's the impact, tangible, like we can see the shifts, if you will, we can see the data points moving. And I don't know that it also necessarily works like that, you know? So I don't know that it's a one-to-one that you can say this artwork, this person, this exhibition enacted social change on a macro level, but I think you can absolutely say on a micro level, every exhibition that I've worked on, I really believe it has enacted change for individual people who have come to see that show, who have come to those institutions to kind of have their subjectivity expanded, their kind of idea of who belongs, what kind of ideas are in the world, how can I move through the world, what kind of experiences are the other people around me speaking from. To me, that does change the world, you know, and is it quantifiable? I don't know. No, it's not quantifiable, but to me, that is the power and the importance of art. Whether it is whatever, any type of art, is that it has the capacity to kind of shift how we see the world, which inherently, you know, which maybe is kind of utopian and sometimes perhaps even naive to think that way, but the alternative for me is not, it's not productive, it's not generative. So I say yes. I don't know if...
I mean, I say yes too, and I think that we are living in a world with very simple, I mean, the social networks, the media offer us a very simplest understanding of the world, and as artists, I think we try to complexify a little bit the narratives, but also the questions. And when you come to an exhibition, I think the first thing is to just create a space where people can just think, and it's already something, like just not being in front of your smartphone and consume, in a way, content, and being in another space where visual art can offer another perspective as humans, because also that's the thing. I think maybe if we decided, maybe we did not decide it, but if we are visual artists and creatives, it's also because we wanted as individuals to do something, to create something who can have real meanings and create the possibilities of just questionings and having emotions and think about the past, the history. And I think that in a society where the consuming of all these types of contents, art is really like a necessity. And as artists, I truly believe that it's very necessary. And also, like during the COVID time, during lockdown, we just saw that people were going back to read books, to see contents on computers, like videos, podcasts, and I think, yeah, there is a necessity to keep that alive. And, yeah.
Thank you.
It's right behind you. Yes. Okay. Yeah, go.
Hi. I don't really have a question. I want to thank you for an enlightened meeting today, a beautiful conversation. I'm from San Francisco. I'm vice chair of the Museum of the African Diaspora, and this is a commercial for people here who don't know about our museum. We're about 20 years old this year, and it was formed to celebrate what you've been talking about, the African diaspora, and to help develop and showcase artists who have not been represented. And although he's been represented many times, many places, HANK WILLIS THOMAS has been there, and Marianne Ibrahim, who was here.
She's right here. She's in front of you.
Oh, right here. Has artists who have been there, and we are a very joyful, wonderful, welcoming place, and we have really helped develop many new careers. And I want you to come here to San Francisco and see the museum, because I think it will really help with this discussion in deepening your understanding about what art can do when you can see what a very young museum is doing in this space. Thank you.
It's a great museum, so we've been there many times. And then, yes, right here. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maurice. I'm Parisian. I have Senegalese backgrounds. Thank you for having us. I have a question for Raphael. First, bravo for your exhibition. It was amazing.
Thank you.
So you talked about representation, and I was thinking, how do you make your art spread in the suburbs where you work? And do you collaborate with the cities or schools so that your art is outside of Paris? Because you've been to the Panthéon, you've been to Palais de Tokyo. How do you deal with spreading your arts in the suburbs? Thank you.
So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of institutions in the suburbs. We have the Macval, where I did some exhibitions by the past, who is in Créteil, in the south, not Créteil, Vitry. Yeah. And we have some art centers too. So one of my first solo exhibition was in a small confidential art center in Alfortville, for example. But in Seine-Saint-Denis, where I grew up and where I still work, there is a real lake of institutions, of spaces. When I left school, I did with a collective a building who is called the 6B, who was more like a collective space for studios and exhibitions, but it was totally like an artist-run space, totally not supported by public funds. But it's still a real question, like to show the work in those kind of territories who are a little bit in the same, I would say, position than some Caribbean territories who are still French, like in Martinique, for example. It's interesting to see that the only big space where you can show art is a former plantation. So I'm speaking about the Fondation Clément, and this is very questioning in a way to see that old family of Béquet in Martinique on the only institutional space in Martinique. So yeah, that's interesting to see how the suburbs like Seine-Saint-Denis are in a way the same kind of have the same kind of treatment in terms of culture and art, even if sometimes local politicians try to bring a little bit of money on the table. But I mean, in my perspective, if I have a project to do directly in Seine-Saint-Denis, I will do it. There is no question about it.
Maybe I could add something, because it's also the task and the mission of the museums to make the schools come to the museums. Also schools from Saint-Denis. I mean, today, at least 30% to 40% of the visitors are coming from schools. So it's really part of our mission to have children, and it's so important because we're talking about how art can change somehow your life, and it's a quite often perspective that we have heard. For example, if you take just one important artist today, Jean-Michel Otoniel, he went to the Museum of Saint Etienne when he was a kid, and it changed his life. He decided to be an artist when he came with his class. So it's just, we have to keep in mind all these beautiful stories, because it's also part of the, of the mission of our museum, of public museums.
Good evening. I've always wondered about the difference between appropriation and inspiration, because people's opinions are really different. So I did wanted to know all of your opinions about it, because in school we learn about the difference, but it's good to know new opinion.
The difference between, you said curation and inspiration?
No, appropriation.
Appropriation. I was like, what? Appropriation and inspiration. I think the difference is transparency and acknowledgement. Inspiration implies you say your sources. It's like if you're writing an essay, you cite your sources. To me, that's inspiration. Appropriation exists in a space more of, we don't speak, we act as if the inspiration is not there, and that we just kind of came to it. We don't acknowledge, we don't cite our sources, essentially. That's what I think the difference is.
Clémentine?
Hello, it's nice to see you. I would... sorry.
Take your time.
I want to ask, why did you want to work on this topic specifically?
To both of us?
All of you.
Yeah.
You go first.
Okay. It was a very natural inspiration. I will say that all the topics that I manage in my work are pre-existing when I studied my scholarship at the Beaux-Arts when I was a student. All those subjects were already there. And one day I showed an old portfolio to my gallerist, Marianne, who is in front row. And she was surprised how my portfolio when I was a student was combining all the different topics of my actual work now. So I would say that it was very natural, maybe unconscious also. And I've always been interested in history. If I wouldn't have been an artist, maybe I would have been a historian teacher. So, you know, it was very here, and all the subjects about memory, the struggles against slavery, they were there since a while. Also because in my family we had a lot of, my mother, for example, was director of an association who were fighting for the memory of the abolition of slavery in Guadeloupe, for example. So, you know, all those topics were there, and I just created a way to express myself about that visually and symbolically, and yeah, that's what I can say about it.
I think for me, this gives me an opportunity to just speak someone's name, Koyo, who just passed away on Saturday night, a curator from Cameroon who worked in the United States, in Europe, on the continent, South Africa, Senegal, was to curate the next Venice Biennial 2026, and died at 58 years old. And I'd say I want to bring up Koyo because I want all of you to know her name if you don't, to look her up, to look up her work. Incredibly impactful human being, first and foremost. but also curator, supporter of artists, believer in culture and the power of culture and creativity to shift our own experiences in the world, but also the world. And so I think, when I think about how did I get into this, this field or this job or my interest within this field, it's because of people like Koyo. It's because of institutions like the Studio Museum in Harlem, my first job, soon to reopen in the fall. MOAD, people like Hank's mother, Deborah Willis, many, many, many curators, artists, historians, just really primarily Black women in the world who said that the work that I do is important. The places I come from, the people I come from are important, and I'm going to speak them into rooms like this. All over the world, wherever I go, I will be myself and I will carry my people with me. And so I think in this moment, that's how I would think about how I got here. Yeah. Anybody else want to talk about how they got to be this person?
Good evening. Maybe the next. Anybody? Is it working?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, and my name is Armelle Chatelier, and I'm working at the French Foundation for Remembrance of Slavery, which is a new institution. And I had the privilege to work with Raphaël on different projects. The motto of the foundation is, alors je vais peut-être le dire en français d'abord, c'est histoire, culture, citoyenneté. History, culture, and citizenship. I don't know, citizenship is kind of I'm not sure about the translation. Because to open the conversation about race in France and 400 years of history of slavery, which in France is totally invisible. What we did since 6 years, because that 6 years we've been created, we passed through artists' work and collaboration with artists, because the way Raphaël say it in France, so there's no conversation. Huh? We open the conversation, but the complexity of the subject and the long time history cannot be done on black and white or whatever. It's much more than that in the French history and in the French identity in terms of long history. We have places like that. We work on central places where we put back the history of everybody, try to open the main narrative of France. And thanks to artists, because artists open conversations like filmmakers, and we have a couple of films who are made on the history of slavery lately, very good films. We have Fanon, for example, who just who's on the screen now. We had a couple of exhibitions, and while Raphaël had this exhibition on the top in the Panthéon, on the first ground or whatever basement of the Panthéon, we had an exhibition on the history of slavery. And these two visions were responding each other. So I invite you, I see many collaborators of the foundation, to watch, and especially young people. You can go beyond the social media, and we try to give keys, to explore more. So thank you for this conversation, because I think we've been very inspired by American conversations, and now we open doors with some of the concepts that were worked in United States, and I'm a deep fan of Hank work. So I hope we're going to have conversations. Well, and Raphaël, of course, but with Raphaël we collaborate already. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think
we are going to continue conversing and exchanging during a more informal moment. There is a cocktail waiting for you all in Salle Bourjac. You go outside in the main courtyard cross it and it's just opposite. Mais on peut se poser aussi les questions. En fait, on s'est fait taper sur les doigts parce que notre collègue qui doit fermer la salle nous a dit qu'il était un peu bloqué. Mais je pense que vraiment, il ne faut pas hésiter à rester un peu pour un petit verre de l'amitié et poser vos questions. Et puis, well, before we move on to any drinks or any cocktail, j'aimerais bien, en fait, I would like all the young people who came today to move to the front and take a picture with our group, because it would be a really good thing.
And I also, just quickly, I just want to thank Clementine for everything, everybody.
Just as a closing remark, and this will encourage another round of applause for the artists, each year I'm very, very worried about the quality of the exchanges, and each time there is a miracle on stage and everything is great. So thank you so much for making a dream come true.